data binding in Angular, and few points I showed you. So we discussed about the technique of interpolation, and another one is property binding. Interpolation is not great every time because interpolation is one way technique only, one way and one time rendering. Actually, one time rendering means rendering is generating output. So we do that by using this binding expression. Property binding, we discussed about property binding. Property binding is the right way to bind to the properties of elements. So element can have a property which is defined with property and whatever the value. So that means dynamic reference value. You can bind that and you can store that value into it. This is good because I showed you that it can update continuously. So it can allow to update continuously. But one problem is there because you might have learned in HTML. In HTML, every element comprises of attributes. In HTML, every element comprises of attributes. So dynamically to control them, we need properties. So elements actually have tags will actually have attributes. For example, so we have img, src. Here src is an attribute. So and class is an attribute. But if I want to deal with these two dynamically, that means in JavaScript, suppose we created an image by using document.create element, we can create an element. Now to this src, you can apply dynamically. Now here src is property. Above src is attribute. And you might have learned in HTML and JavaScript that every attribute will not have the same name property. If I want to dynamically apply class to image, what property I have to use? Can you tell me? Which property I have to use to apply a class dynamically? For src, we have same name property. For src, we have same name property. For width and height, we have same name property. Pic.height, pic.width, same name. What about class? Do you have a property called class? Do you have a property called class in JavaScript if you want to apply? So then how you apply a class in JavaScript to image? What we have to do? What do you say? Which property we have to use? No. You people learned HTML, JavaScript. You people know HTML, JavaScript, right? Which property is used to apply class dynamically? That is the question asked to you. What do you say? What, all 200s of people are sleeping? Are you awake? I asked you some question. Which class is used? Which property is used to apply the class dynamically to any image? Not only image, in JavaScript, to apply class dynamically to any element. So you have a property called class name. Haven't you learned this class name property? Haven't you learned this class name property in JavaScript? Haven't you learned this class name property? You learned class name property, right? Yeah. I hope everyone learned class name property, right? Yes, right. So that means what is class and what is class name? What do you say? Difference. What is class and what is class name? What is difference? What do you call class as? Class is attribute and the class name property. Property. Am I right? Class is attribute and class name is property. So I hope you learned this difference, that dynamically we use the properties. But what is the concept here is, sometimes some HTML elements, attributes are not available as properties. Some attributes are not available as properties. Some elements. Then what we have to do is we have to apply with CS style. For example, suppose we have like table. I will take an example of a table. Actually, for table tag, you can give width attribute. We can give border attribute. You can give frame attribute. You can give rules attribute. So frames, rules, width, you can give height attribute. Like this, you can define that. Now the point is, actually, width, height, border, frame, rules, all these work for table. But unfortunately, if I want to dynamically change them, so we created a table dynamically, document dot create element. We can create a table element, and you say table dot width is equal to some width. Table dot border is equal to some border. Table dot frame is equal to some box, something. Table dot rules is equal to all. And table dot height is equal to some 200. This is invalid. Why it is invalid? Because table have height as attribute, but it is not having height as property, then HTML can apply height, but JavaScript cannot apply height by using the name height. You don't have that. How do we know? Generally in JavaScript, how do we know what properties are present for any element? You can simply write some program like, suppose, see, I will write a small program here just for your reference understanding sake. Okay, I'm adding some new file, demo HTML. Okay, you see here, I'm writing some script. So function and function one, and here we are configuring. So table is equal to document dot create element. Create element. We are creating a table element. And for table, I am defining, I want to know what properties it contains. For where, property, property in, property in table. So it is used to read all the properties. Document dot write, we will print that property. That means we are reading all the properties of table and printing it. And you can see all the properties of table that we are printing. And these are all the properties. So many properties are there for table. This is how you can know the properties. Observe here. So I will search in this list. Class, you see, there is no class. It is called class name. We have class name, class list, but there is no class. But table can be applied with class as an attribute, but as a property, it is class name. Similarly, suppose I am defining border. So border is available. I am defining width. Width is available. I am defining height. Height is not there. Offset height is different. It's not height. We don't have height, you see. Some scroll height, offset heights are there. There is no height at all. You don't invent anything new. They will not work. You have to know what is available with them. That is the point. So then how you apply height for table? Generally, if height is not available, then how you will apply? Generally, in JavaScript, what you have to do is, if it is not having height property and I have to apply, then obviously I have to use an option table dot. I can apply through style dot height, and I can apply the height. That's better. That's how we do generally, in general. That means every HTML element is not having the properties to control dynamically, as it is having attributes to control statically. This is the problem with HTML and JavaScript dynamic combination. This issue will come everywhere because not only in JavaScript, even in Angular or React or any other technologies, you are dynamically dealing with HTML. To dynamically deal any element in HTML, you need its relative property. If it is not, you have to think about alternative. So that means now what you have to do here is, suppose I'm designing some table. So I will just clean up this here. Yeah. I will put some table here. So table. In that I given some table. So row and in the table cell some name, something roughly we added some content here. Usually it contains T body, T head, like these things, and we are adding some. Now, what happens is inside this table, table body, table row, whatever the content we are adding. And this table row and table content, we can keep with proper height and width. Okay, let's do with the proper height and width. That means first I will give you the property. Let's add a div and container this, remove this here. Yeah. So I will remove this here. I'm defining just dynamically some width. So width is a property, and this is having some value, some 300. So height is some property. That means here we defined as some 200, like this. These are some basic options. So border, border, someone value. Now we are designing a table here. So we are designing a table here. So table, in the table, I'm designing some T body, table body, in that table row, in that table cell, some name. I will put the class here as margin top, some 3. Now, for this table, it looks clean actually. So I will access the table. So that looks normal. This is normal. We don't have much any content there. So I will apply container. Yeah. Then it is like this. The alignment's okay. Now I am applying these dynamically. So with the height border. So here I'm using a property binding technique, which I already told you. And we are using width. Width is available as a property, and I will apply that width. So that is defined inside the logic. And we have border. Border is also a property. Here I will apply the border. So the border we define here. So I will keep this uppercase. Okay. Border is there. So width and border are defined. Okay. You see now table have width and border. I am defining now, trying to define height. And it clearly says that there is no height property because it is not a property of table. Cannot bind to height since it's not property. It's not known property of table element. So we don't have that height property. Already we saw that. I showed you that there is no height. Then earlier what we have to do is we have to use style. Through style we have to apply. But now in Angular, they have provided a attribute binding technique. That means you can tell Angular that, okay, don't apply this as a property. So try this in attribute. Is there any attribute by this name? Try this through attribute and apply. For that, we have to tell Angular that height is not property. Okay. It is an attribute. Then we have to use attr dot height. That means now we are telling Angular that it's not property, it's an attribute. And to this attribute, so we are applying that height. So we are applying that height dynamic value. Now, when I configured that, then it is going to display the height of, it's working fine. Directly, it cannot work. So this is attribute binding. That means many times one question comes, which one is best. Property binding is the correct way. But every element attribute is not available as property. Then either use with style or use attribute binding technique. Attribute binding allows Angular to understand that so HTML element is not having a property, then I will pull its attribute and apply this value to the attribute. That is the reason. So we can bind in three ways. Interpolation, we can bind to property, and we can bind to attribute. Generally, people call as interpolation, property binding, attribute binding. That means where to bind the result, to the property or to attribute. We need both of them because depending on situation. So if element is having an attribute and no property, then attribute binding is the only way. Or else you can go with style concept. Styles I will show you. Next level, we will see how styles can be used. But this is one option in data binding. Data binding. But important is the data binding. By default, it is one-way binding. One-way binding. That means it reads from source and updates to view. It will read from source and update to view. So read from source and update to view. That is the technique it is following. Now, any change in the view is not updating back. Any change in the view is not updating back. I will show you that point. See, suppose we are designing some property here as some username, some your name. That is some sample text. I given some sample text. And this I want to display in two locations actually. Suppose here I will put a simple field set with a legend. So legend, and here I will give as username. And so this is text box. Input type is equal to text. And to the text box, inside text box, if I want to display anything, usually I have to use value property. To that, we have to bind username. That's what we are doing. And below that, so I will keep a horizontal line and I keep a heading. So here I want to display hello. And that username should bind here. So that username we are binding here. That means we are displaying the username in heading and we are binding to this location. So that means now see what happens is that's how it will display. So username and your name. And I am doing some modification here. Actually, when I am doing some modification here, this value is coming from, let me show you that in the screen area here. Okay. Fine. I will show you what is happening in the background actually. That is one-way binding means what happens here. Now this is the content, and here what we have is in the TypeScript file we have a property. So username property. Username property is having that value. That means it is having the value. So your name. Now this value is binded to two locations actually. This is binded to this text box and it is binded to this location inside a heading. Now what happens is whatever the value present and configured inside it, it is displayed there. Now, obviously, this hello username will not allow to make any change because it is just a label. But a text box allows to make change. That means here I am changing this username, this value, and I am modifying with some other value. So John, this must update back to this location. It should update back to that location. It should update back to that location. If it is updated back to this location, that means if this username is assigned with John, then automatically it should reflect here. So again, the name must be displayed as John here. Hello, John should come. So let's see, is it happening or not? That is two-way binding actually. This is two-way binding. Now we will see, is it happening or not? One-way binding working because from the data source, it is coming and attaching to your element. It's working. Two-way working or not? You see, I made some change here, some David. It's not working. I'm trying some change. It's not working. It's not affecting here. Means it's not changing. This is one-way binding. Actually, to achieve two-way binding technique, we have to use lot of work. You have to do lot of work in JavaScript jQuery. Last session I showed you, we need events. Events means on key up, on blur, on change, on click, such events we need. And we need to do lot of DOM manipulation, get element by ID assigned to some reference like that. Lot of DOM manipulations and events are required. That means property binding and event binding. These are required for handling two-way binding. That means we need to identify whether change happened or not. And whenever any change happened, we need to update back to the source property. So that means actually two-way binding can be handled in several ways. For that, to handle two-way binding, Angular uses two frameworks. It uses MVC and Mvvm, client-side model view controller, and client-side model view model. I will show you that. What are these, how this work, we will see. Client side, Angular uses MVC and Mvvm client side. So what is the approach of MVC and Mvvm? Let's see. Actually, the concept of MVC, Mvvm, MVC is model view controller. I will not go into the histories and all. Why? Because you will learn them in server-side technologies in your Spring Boot and all. I hope you will go into that MVC concept. Actually, the main concern of MVC is code separation and code reusabilities. Entire application is separated into three major components. So one is the controller, the model, and the view. Actually, model represents data. View represents UI, user interface. And controller defines the application logic. That means in MVC, what happens is, whatever data is there, this controller will pick the data. Controller plays the key role here. Controller will pick the data and it will update to the view. Any change happened in the view, it will again update back to the controller, and controller will store that into the model. Controller will send to the model. That is the approach. That means controller plays the key role in handling communication between the view and model. Actually, here our controller is the .ts file, and here view is the .html. That means the presentation, and model is your temporarily cache memory. Cache memory where data is stored actually temporarily. It can be cache memory. So in the cache, there are so many techniques in web technologies. You can use cookies. So you can store as query strings. So many techniques are there. So data will be in the cache memory, means browser memory. And that data will be accessed and presented. Again, it is updated back. Later, we can bring this data from API. Later, we can bring it from API. That means backend databases, server-side technologies we can do later. Initially, to keep data in memory, we need model. Okay. And to handle interaction with the data and user interface, we need controller. Controller defines the communication between model and view. It gets the data from the model and presents to the view. Again, get backs and identifies. For that, actually, this is MVC framework. For that, actually, we need a binding technique. That means Angular provides a directive. Angular provides a directive called, the directive is called ng model. ng model. The purpose of directive is to make HTML more declarative, more dynamic, makes HTML dynamic actually. So this ng model is present inside forms module, and this forms module is present inside Angular forms library. So if you want to use this ng model to handle two-way binding through MVC approach, then you have to import this forms module. And that forms module is available in Angular forms. So from Angular forms, you have to import the forms module, then you will get ng model. This ng model will help you in handling two-way binding. What this ng model will do? Actually, it uses the property and attribute binding technique. Property and attribute binding technique I will show you. That means it uses both property and attribute binding technique. That means actually, so we have two representations, square brace. This is property binding. We have parenthesis. This is event binding. Actually, in JavaScript, we write events. For suppose button, we write on click like this, and some function. In Angular, so the events are defined in parenthesis and just click and some function. That's how we bind the event. Later, we will have a separate session on event binding. I will tell you detailed points about events. Same your JavaScript events only we have to use here. So this is event binding. Now, for example, now that means now events are defined in parenthesis, and this is in square brace. Property is in square brace. Now, ng model is represented in this way. ng model is represented in this way. That means, for example, you are using a text box. Input type is equal to text. And in the text ng model, we define some username, something like this. Now, what happens is this makes the text box dynamic with two-way binding. So not only text box, all controls. I will show you other controls also. Now, what is difference? What is the point here is why square brace and parenthesis? Square brace indicates that username will be applied to its default property, to its property. Username will be applied to text box property. Text box property means text box have a property called value. To the value property, username will be applied. Okay, good. And parenthesis indicates that it will work on an event. It will identify the changes on an event. Can you tell me what will be the event for a text box whenever the value is changed? Which event may fire up? Whenever value changes, which event fires up for text box? Whenever value changes, which event fires up? You learn JavaScript events. Which event is used to identify change? Which event is used to identify the change in value? To identify the change in the value. So actually, you can have key up event, key up, but key up, key down are not just identifying, means editing can be done in any way. That is the reason the default event actually will be on change. Default will be on change. On change indicates that value changed. On change indicates that value changed. That means now this ng model is going to use the default property and default event of this text box. So you don't need to write any event. It will use the default event and the default property. It will get the value and bind. So that means first what will happen is it will get that username value. So what we have username value. That means username is present inside. So in the TypeScript, we have username. This username is configured with some your value. Now what it will do is, first, through property binding technique, it will bring this value and bind to text box. Through property binding technique, it will do that. It will bring the value and bind to text box. After that, through event binding technique, so it will identify the changes in the value and updates back. It identifies the changes in the value and updates back. That means through property binding, it brings the value and binds. Through event binding, it will identify the changes and updates back. That means now ng model is going to handle two-way binding. So that means it gets the value, display, identify the changes in the value and update back. But this ng model is not directly available. You see here. So suppose I want to use that. So ng model now. So here we are writing like this: square brace, parenthesis, ng model. And I am applying this username. And it's not there because ng model is not by default available. To make this available and used by Angular, what we have to do is we have to go to app module. In the app module, we have to import a module. So I will import a module. Import from @Angular forms library. we have forms module. You have to import that forms module, and modules must be registered. Modules must be registered inside this imports. Components must be registered. Components must be registered in declarations, and modules must be registered in imports. It's mandatory that you have to register all the modules in imports. Services are registered in providers. Services are registered in providers. Later you will learn service. Components are configured in declarations, and modules are defined in imports. So here we have to import that forms module. Okay. Now this is ready to use. NG model is ready to use. Now it is working. Now you see it is working. Once you configure that it is working, and now you see here, and I do some change here, and it is updating back, and it is working fine. I don't need to write any event. I don't need any DOM manipulations. Actually, if I have to do the same work in JavaScript or jQuery, so we have to write event. We have to use the DOM manipulations. So now you don't need to do that. So you just use this references. You need to configure the references and define the references. So technically, that is how it is going to manage and update the options. This is basically done with the help of two-way binding technique. Right? So how two-way binding is configured and two-way binding is handled. That is the basic approach. If I don't do this, this is one-way binding. It is one-way binding. And this is not only for just text box, any control. Let's create a form and configure a form. So, and let's see how it works. So let's design a complex form here and how we can manage that. So how we can handle the data. I'm creating here some properties, some name. Name is a property and it is empty. No value is configured. It binds that empty value. Price is number. And some option we defined as shipped to. So some value. And that is also a string type. And we have stock, that is a Boolean value, some true or false something. So this is basically how we configured that. Now, the first point is these properties we need to bind. Let's create a form here. Let's design a form. So let's configure a div class as row. And in this, so the div class as call3. And here we have div class as call9. Okay. And these are just your bootstrap options. Then I given a heading as a registered product. And here I have product details. Okay. And here I'm adding a form. So let's create a div and a label. So this is for name. And let's add a text box. Input type is equal to text. And here I configured the class as form control. Just we are designing a form. And another div. So class as margin top. Okay. And a label. So that is price. And we have input type is equal to text. And class as form control. So that is also a text box. Another div. So class as margin top 3 and label as shipped to. And this is a drop down we are configuring here. So I'm using a select and class as form select, and here we have an option. So say daily, some option Hyderabad. Okay, these are the options we have. Okay, now one more div, that is the class margin top 3, and here we have a label stock, and div, here I am using a checkbox. Checkbox. Just our intention is to understand different types of controls actually. So different types of controls. Here we have a label. Yes. So this is actually the options. This is the form we have created. So this is name text box. This is the price text box. This is shipped to, and this is stock. So that's the Boolean. Here, let's change this checkbox to the latest. In Bootstrap, latest checkbox have class form check and a form switch. I will use it as a form switch. Form switch. Okay, and for this we apply the class as form check input. And for this label, we apply the class as form check label. Okay. That is general Bootstrap classes we use for the forms. And this is the latest one. This is your checkbox like a switch now. That is like a switch. So latest Bootstrap provides this checkbox as a list. Switch, you can check that. Okay, that's like checked and unchecked. Now, these details, so we need to display here. I'm creating a data list, data term, some name, data definition, another data term price, and data definition, another data term, so say shipped to, and another data definition, so and another data term stock. Okay, data definition. Now these are the options we have right side to display the content. Okay, let's make this container fluid. So that's better. Okay. Now, whatever the details I'm entering here, so whatever the details I'm configuring here. So this is the right side column. So column, this is the right side column. So margin yes as 3. Just a little, so adjusted here. So it comes to next line. So that space is enough. Okay. Because we given that's 3, 9, because maximum you can have 12 columns. Okay. Now here, whatever the values we are entering, we need to get them and display right side. And by default, so whatever the values are configured here in the properties, you see, they are name, price, shipped to stock. They are initialized with some default values. So we need to bind them. You see here. So I want to bind the name to this control. Just we have to use two-way binding technique. That is, in the square brace, in the parenthesis, we have to use ng model. This will bind with the property name. That's how we configure. That means now it will bring that name value and it will bind to value property. Any change in the value, it will identify and update on change back. The same thing we have to do for others. Just we have to use ng model and it should price. And another drop down, whatever value from the drop down. So we need that ng model, and that is shipped to, shipped to. We are binding to that. Remember, the order is important. First property binding, then event binding. First it brings the property and binds here. then identify the changes, then updates back. That is the reason this order is very important. First, the square brace, inside this, the parenthesis. So because that is property and attribute binding techniques, how we can configure and define. So usually that is the property and attribute binding. And I need to bind with the switch here. This checkbox also same. So we are using the ng model, and we are configuring. Yeah. And here we are defining the option that is check is stock. That's how we need to configure that, right? That is the stock option we defined, right? Now that is ready. The stock is going to bind it to the properties. Anything dynamically happening is property, right? So now generally this is ready, and you see price has empty, name is empty, and shipped to empty because initialized with empty. Now I said some TV, that is some default, price 0, shipped to. Suppose I given Hyderabad. That value will be binded. It picks that value and it will display the value. It is binding it. So we are accessing the properties and binding to these elements. And now, because we are using two-way binding, any change in this, it will update back here. So update back so that we can display here. I want to display them here also. So we will display in the right side. Here we are designing. Basically, we are binding. Already we learned we can use property like inner HTML or inner text, or we can just use interpolation. Because here just we want to display as a literal. So we can just give name. And here we can just give price. Just give price. And here I can just give shipped to. So shipped to. And here we can give stock. Let's write an expression here. So if stock is equal to true, then put some string available. Otherwise, put some string out of stock. That's how we are configuring. And now you see here when we defined that and configured, now those values will come and display here by default. Those values are here. Now, when I'm making any change in that, when I'm making any change into this, that means some change, it will update back. I'm changing the price and configuring, it will update back. I'm choosing any city, it will define that. And you can see here, so stock out of stock, I switch this to yes, then it is available. So, and no out of stock. So that is just switching the checkbox. Actually, it is a traditional checkbox. If I don't use this form switch, because that is the new concept of checkbox actually, if I don't use that, so then it looks like an ordinary checkbox. That's like an ordinary checkbox. And Bootstrap has the new attributes. So Bootstrap has new options, new classes. Those new classes will apply that into this, and we can display any change in the value. It will configure and define the change, and it will update back there. This is identifying the changes and updating. This is the MVC approach actually. That means the data comes from the model and configures into the controller. Controller will send to the view. Here controller is actually the data is coming from this location. So these properties, any change you make, that will first update into this location, and this will update back to the UI. So that is using a data binding technique, So you need to configure lot of properties, and these properties you have to bind to the UI and define. So this is generally using MVC architecture, the model view controller. We have another approach, that is an Mvvm architecture. In Mvvm architecture, what happens is generally we have model. In Mvvm architecture, we have model, and we have view model. So view model and view, these options will be there. That means no controller actually, no controller. This view model will be integrated with the view only, user interface only. That means this is in the UI, in the user interface. That means in the HTML file, you configured this. That means your presentation and logic both are present in the UI itself. That means the presentation and logic both are present in the UI itself, and they will interact with the model, bind with the model, gets the data from the model and update back to here. There is no separate controller. That means actually in the .ts file, we maintain some properties, name, price, shipped to, all these things we have defined. Now, generally, these need not to be configured anymore. That means you don't need this configuration at all. We don't need that configuration at all. Everything you can manage in the UI itself. That means directly from the view, it updates to the model. And directly from the model, it can update back to the view. So this is good and bad. So many options will be there. What is difference is nothing but actually, if you are using MVC, then clean separation. So separation of logic, separation of UI, and the data. Clean separation will be there. It will be easy to extend. We can easily extend the functionality. Easy to test, because clean separation of every part. That means your logic will be separate, your presentation will be separate, clean separation. So, but what is problem is, the problem is initial bundle size is large. So large bundle size, that means because it has to handle three files. That means the .ts file, .css file, .html file. So initial bundle size will be large. That means initial load time will be more. So it will take time to load. Initial load time, it will be load. After loading, it can perform fast, but initial load time will be slow. These problems will be there with the MVC approach. That is the reason, if you want some interactions in such a way, that you don't need regular extensions. We don't need regular changes, extensions, adding new things, removing existing. If we have a stable functionality and we carry on that stable functionality for several days, several months, so we don't need to do any change. So in that case, better you can go with MVVM. What is the advantage of MVVM? Everything is managed in the UI. Everything is managed in the UI. You configure in UI. You manipulate in UI. So you present in UI. Configuration, manipulation, presentation, everything in the UI only. Everything in the UI. What is the drawback is it is hard to test. It is hard to extend, but reduces initial bundle size. It will reduce initial bundle size, but the problem here is, so page becomes heavy. Page is heavy page, because it will reduce the initial loading time. But after loading, responding will be slow. That means it responds slow. Why? Because everything is happening in the UI. It will take a lot of time to load the UI, because it have to handle interaction in the UI, present in the UI. So this is good if you are trying to handle interactions, and you are trying to manage the interactions without regular extensions. So you are designing some form and interface which doesn't require regular extensions, then you can go with this MVVM. Now see how MVVM works. Same concept, but this time we don't have these properties. That means no configuration here at all. No configuration. We don't have the name and all properties are not there. Then how you will handle the binding? So it's simple here. What we have to do this time, you see, for every element, first you have to configure a name. This name, without name, so Angular cannot accept the value of any element. So it's mandatory that every element should have a name. Okay. This is not required when you are using a controller approach. If you are handling everything in the UI, every element should have a name. Okay. Its name is name. Okay. This name is price. Okay. This name is shipped to. And this name, every element have a name. So this name is stock. We defined the names. After defining the name, they are not still dynamic. To make them dynamic, we have to add ng model. This makes it dynamic. So adding ng model will make every element dynamic. Angular cannot recognize and handle that element if it is not defined with the model. So just ng model makes it dynamic. Okay, good. Only ng model makes it dynamic. Okay. And it allocates memory for this control. Ng model will allocate memory for this control to store its value. But in the memory, under which name it should store the value. That means model should have a reference name for this element to store its value. So then ng model will use a reference, ID reference. You define ID reference with hash name. This is the memory reference name in model. In model, memory reference is defined with hash and any name. You can give any name. And remember, so this must be handled by model to store the value. we mark this as NG model. That means first we are making the element dynamic. After making the element dynamic, we are allocating a space in the memory by name hash. That means in the model, a reference name is created by name this name. And in that reference name, it will keep the value entered inside this text box. Whatever value of the text box, it will get the value and store in this name. That means what it is going to do is, it is going to allocate memory actually. It is going to allocate memory. That is going to allocate memory. That means this is NG model. In this, so it will allocate memory for different values. It will allocate the, and this memory reference is defined with the property like hash name. It is defined like hash price. So, and that is the reference. So the hash stock. Hash indicates that it is an ID reference. ID reference means it must be unique. That means there must be value with the same name. There cannot be any another value with the same name. It must be unique. Then we define with hash. Hash indicates that it is an ID reference. ID reference specifies that it must be unique. So now what happens is, now you are binding with this text box. Input type is equal to text. And to this text box, we are configuring ng model, and we are defining hash name is equal to ng model. That means we are configuring the value into that. That means now whatever value we enter into it, like John, some value. Now what it will do is, it will store this value. It will store this value. It is going to handle this value. It is going to take and store this value in this location. It will manage that in that location. And ng model will identify the change in that, and it will update the changes back anywhere. So that means here we don't need anything to configure in the controller. We don't need to configure anything in the controller. Controller is empty. Controller is not having any property related to this now. So we are not declaring any property, configuring here itself, everything configured here. If you are using inline documentation technique and everything you have to manage through UI, this approach is good. That means now what you can do, ng mode. Okay, here hash price is equal to ng model. ng model. Okay, same. Here I am defining again hash shipped to, and that is ng model. So ng model. So that is shipped to. We are configuring here. So this is shipped to. And we need one more, that is stock. So here hash stock is equal to ng model. And these ID references you have to use for presenting. The same we are using for presenting. That's okay. That's okay. So that means we are using the same for the presentation. So we are configuring the same here, stock. Now you see here, by default, its stock is not having any value. That means it is not having any value because it will always return false because there is no default value mentioned. Default value, and this is not configured with any value by default. It will be false by default because you are configuring dynamically and there is no default value. It will be taking it as false. That means you have to write if is equal to stock equal, because by default it is false. Suppose if I say checked means by default it is true, but it will not know until or unless you do some changes into this. Checked is to enable true. So here if I say false, that means we are checking with the false, or I'm checking say true. So it's saying that initially, see, condition will return always false because ng model have no type to overlap with the Boolean. It is not having anything to overlap with Boolean. That means either true, either false. Only two options are there. There is nothing else configured here. One more technique is there. We will see that. So that means we will see the technique, how it works. That means here we are binding with stock. Previously, what is advantage? We can initialize some value into this. That means initially that stock can contain some value into it. Due to that, no problem. Suppose I am not writing any condition, just I am displaying that stock. It's okay. That means I am displaying the stock. It's okay. Why? Because it will display true or false. How to bind expression, I will show you now. Because generally we don't have any default value. Here we can use, as I told you in the contracts, properties can be nullable. If property is nullable, actually we can configure this with a question mark. Question mark indicates that it is nullable. We can configure that nullable, and we can write the condition. That means here we can write stock and question mark, so is equal to some false. Like this we can configure, or true. We can configure that, so true or false. And we put here some value and options. And again, so other values. But as of now, we don't have any default value configured inside that. That is the reason it will say that, so this can be either true or false. True or false. That means it cannot be either of these. Okay, we will see how to write such expressions now. If there is no value, how to put default value. We will see that. Initially, let's access the value. You will see that it will work. It will get true or false by default. You can observe here now. This time, what we are doing is, we are not doing anything configured, means we are not configuring anything inside this controller. Every concept is configured and defined in the UI itself. And all the interactions are managed in the UI only. Now you can see here, it shows that this is an object, this is an object, this is an object. This is what we need to understand. That means object means what? This indicates that, this name indicates that, this name indicates that stock reference, it is referring to text box. That means, remember, actually direct value is not stored inside this reference. Actually, this name is referring to this text box. In this name, you have a property called value. You have a property called the memory is allocated for entire text box. This is the point you have to know. It is allocated for entire text box. It is allocated for text box, not just only for value. In that it can have value. In that it can have so lot of other properties, like other properties you will learn later, like valid, like invalid, like pristine. So many other things will be there, which we are going to learn in next level. Forms concept we will discuss detailing. As of now, that is the reason you need to understand that checkbox, drop downs, text boxes, you are binding with the model, means you are not binding their value, you are binding entire control, entire element. When you are binding entire element, then it will show that problem here. This is all objects. Now in the name object, we need to access value. Price object, I need to access value. Shipped to, I need to access the value. Stock, I need to access the value. And now I can write here, because the value will be true or false. Then we have to define if value is equal to true. Then I will put here available. Otherwise, I will put here out of stock. That is the right way. Why we cannot directly apply? Because it is a control. You cannot directly write anything to control. You need to get the value and handle it. That means this stock refers to checkbox, not checkbox value. Checkbox checked. So this refers to drop down. shipped to, not drop down value. It has lot of properties. So we have to access the value and display. And you can see that now the values are displayed here. Empty is there. And I am entering some value. It's displayed. Some price, it is displayed. And shipped to, it is displayed. And stock, it's working. But this time, there is no controller. We don't have a controller. That means we are not using controller interactions. It doesn't mean that, so we don't need controller every time. It depends on requirement. Remember, in one component, both approaches may be used. That means in one component itself, for few interactions, we use MVC, and few interactions, we use Mvvm. We will use both combinations also sometimes, because in a component, I can handle multiple forms. It's not like you have to handle only one form. Later in Angular forms concept, I will explain that. We will have a separate discussion on forms. Currently, we are having discussion on not forms, on data binding. So when we discuss about forms, we will see that component can have multiple forms. Component can have nested forms. In that multiple forms, nested forms, we need to handle both in one component itself. So it's not like which one is best. Which one is best depends on my requirement and the situation. If you see what is problem in this, you will see that the problem in this is nothing but basically the problem in this is the response and load time will be more every time. Why? Because your page becomes very heavy. You can see lot of logic is there, lot of references, lot of interactions happening here. UI becomes very complicated. It's not very clean. Your user interface means text box means only this is enough actually with class name. All these things doesn't look great every time. Why? Because lot of dynamic references, lot of other interactions happening. So it becomes heavy for user interface and not clean for user interface. So we need to keep the user interface clean and separated in certain occasions so that we can easily extend it. So sometimes we don't need any extensions. So we need a stable functionality across any number of requests, then this is best. So that is depending on the situation and requirement. So for MVC approach, we have used this binding technique, NG model. For Mvvm approach, we have used NG model. We have used a reference name. We need a reference ID. In that, we need to bind with NG model. These three things we have to do, especially when you are dealing with Mvvm approach. In MVC approach, just create a property and bind to it. In Mvvm approach, these three are mandatory. If any one is missed, it will not work. All the three are mandatory. Even if you don't define a name, it will not work. These are the basic approaches we need to follow. This is data binding the data and working with the data. Now, once you know how data binding works, now we will see some more interactions here, like iterations, conditions, how we can present and interact, creating the forms, presenting them, all these things we have to discuss. That we will see in our next session, okay? So tomorrow we will continue with that. In tomorrow's session, we will discuss more about data binding and creating real world forms, handling the interactions with them, okay? Right.